Hello, everybody. Thanks for being with us. I hope you're ready for an unforgettable journey over the next 8 to 10 hours. I'm kidding, but we would have enough things to discuss, I think, for such a long time. But we're going to make a speed dating over roughly 2 hours on science communication in a changing world, trends on science advice, and how we can coordinate and put together things among the science community, but also towards the society, the societal needs, and especially also policy making. My name is Christian Penny. I'm a scientific officer and relations manager at the Scientific and Research Service of the Luxembourg Parliament, and I will guide you, will be your shepherd during the next time. We will have a great program, especially with a panel, which will follow the keynote address, with 4 wonderful panelists that have been chosen. And but first of all, we will have a keynote address by a person who has been, I think, perfectly been chosen for this kind of discussions, for the 2 topics that are interrelated. But a person also, David Budtz Pedersen, who is traveling around the world as an invited keynote speaker, who has, I think, in May not been a lot over in Denmark, but all around the world. David, we are really thrilled to having you here today and for having this discussion together with you. David, you're a professor of science communication at Aalborg University in Denmark and director of humanomics, which we will maybe clarify a little bit as a term later on in Copenhagen, with a PhD, and I love it, in philosophy of science.
Yes.
Science policy studies, and so many things more, because we're going to have a look at your fingerprint, which is huge, in a minute. You made research days at the University of Vienna, at New York University, and as I already said, I've had many collaborations all around the world. You are a science policy advisor for many governments and agencies, funding agencies. You are involved in knowledge transfer, and the term also we're going to address today is this knowledge brokering aspect. You have a tremendous amount of scientific publications and contributions to the community, and you're a member and chair of many national and international committees, expert groups, networks, and so on and so forth. But without longer saying for myself, the floor is yours. Welcome, David Budtz Pedersen.
Thank you. Thanks. Well, thank you very much, Christian, for that very generous introduction. I think the expectations are high, and rightly so. I've been looking forward a lot to giving this talk this afternoon, and also to engage with the panel in 30 minutes time from now. I would like to just take the opportunity also to thank Didier and Sean for organizing the event this afternoon, and for having made it possible for me to be here. It's a pleasure to be part of this open lecture series, Trends Under Review, and I think it's a really nice format that you have the opportunity to drop by in a Wednesday afternoon and have a stimulating discussion. So that's what I'm intending to help you provide. I will be speaking a bit about science communication in a changing world. That's really sort of a pet topic of mine. It's a pleasure to be able to make a little bit of a talk going a little bit, taking one step back and looking upon science communication, where we are heading, what we know, what are some of the challenges, and also how can we feed science communication into the hearts and minds, not only of scientists, but also of policymakers, and most importantly, of citizens. And I will be touching upon that a little bit at a glance, giving you an introduction, and then being a little bit more detailed, trying to flesh out a couple of observations from cognitive psychology and social psychology and the sort of things we know about the human mind and how we are selecting for information. This is something we need to understand as science communicators. We cannot just be dropping off facts into an empty void. We need to do translation, and we need to be able to connect with the people for whom science is important. So I will be touching upon that. Luckily enough, Christian already made this slide obsolete. Just a brief CV so that you know that besides being a full-time professor at the University of Aalborg, I also do take the responsibility of being a policy advisor to the Danish government and the Norwegian government and the European Commission. And therefore, I think that my talk this afternoon is also somewhat located in between the world of, let's say, policy and the world of academia. This is a world that is interacting a lot these days. It's almost like a mega trend. There is not 1 month going by without a meeting in Brussels or in Paris or in Stockholm or somewhere else, as Christian also said, in which we're investigating how to create closer links between policymaking and academia, and also naturally, as an extension of that, civil society, companies, businesses. But it's also a world that can be tough to navigate because it's difficult to have a career in which you're performing equally well in academia and policy making. So to be able to sort of bridge that gap became a challenge for myself moving forward in my career. And I think we've come to a place now where there are actually space in our communities for these types of roles of, as Christian said, knowledge brokers or intermediaries or boundary spanners, people who can talk a little bit the language of 2 or more different audiences. So this is also going to be something I will give you a couple of examples of. Then my own area of interest, just as another way of introduction, is, if you like, science of science communication. So I've been conducting more or less systematic studies, both qualitatively but actually also quantitatively, on the scientific behavior, on how to organize and manage scientific institutions, how to evaluate scientific outcomes. And even though that might be a little bit bureaucratic and boring, I think it does belong to the picture that if we want to stimulate proactive science communication, we also have to be able to acknowledge it. If not measure the impact of it, then at least be able to reward it and incentivize it. And for that to happen, we need better models of research assessment and research evaluation, but we also need to rethink our models of academic leadership, how to set up a diverse team in which you might not only rely on the principal investigator to do the science communication, but also hire particular persons to your team, be able to give roles to science communication and put resources into that in ways that does not always follow a classical model of either career development or even team science. So we have been doing research on research processes, on research organizations, on team science, and on, you can say, research evaluation for more than a decade now. And I think that evidence needs to also be accumulating. We need a better understanding, not only of how science is affecting society, but also of how to organize scientific communities and teams so that they perform well. Fortunately enough, I'm not alone in that on that journey. There is a lot of support, as I just mentioned right now, in the policy landscape for how to activate and mobilize science communication. Naturally, after the pandemic, a lot of public policy agencies and institutions, including funding agencies, became aware of that very crucial role of communicating science. You might have excellent science in the laboratory, you might be able to develop the best vaccines in the world, but if you're not able to communicate how they work, their uncertainties, and also to include the perspective of citizens and to engage with the values of society, your vaccine simply will not come far. They won't have the impact that you envisioned when you were standing in the laboratory. So you need to be able to also include as a matter of fact, humanities and social sciences, but in particular communication, and not just doing that as an add-on, but actually understanding how this works sort of becomes a discipline in itself. So even though I might be a little bit polemic this afternoon just to get some blood flowing from your bodies into your brains, I think there can really be no value of research if it is not actively communicated and translated into real world settings. And no matter how much I respect my peers and how much I respect the classical academic ideals, the idea that we are simply producing small journal articles, small PDF files, and sending them out into the world in the form of journal papers, and hoping that some citizen, a policymaker, or even a colleague might find our small PDF files and double-click on them and read them or cite them, and then go on and sort of change the world accordingly. It's just a linear fallacy. It's simply a model that doesn't work. We have more than 30 years of accumulated studies showing that actually research does not disseminate so well in publications. They might be a really important, or they are a really important platform for quality assurance, and it's a golden standard, obviously, for peer review. And as such, I'm not arguing against it. But the idea that the PDF file in and of itself is the best carrier of knowledge into society is simply a fallacy. And still, as I just mentioned a moment ago, we have an entire incentive and reward system that is more or less based on PDF files and other people's reading our PDF files. And if we're super lucky, mentioning our PDF files in their PDF files, because then we can have a nice citation network analysis, and then our funding agencies are happy. But perhaps not so much the taxpayers. I don't know how much they are occupied with citations and PDF files, and I can tell you, for having advised some of them, also not the ministers of finance. They do increasingly find it difficult to understand that what we are getting from public expenditure on science and innovations are PDF files. There needs to be something more done than that. You have to open up the research. Obviously, you have to use research to drive innovation and business development, but that's only one fraction of what we are looking at here. You also need to drive efforts in order to open up research for the public, for policymakers, for young people, for elderly people, for patient and patient organizations. So the picture is not complete either with this simple wall of disseminating articles, but also you could even substitute this with a similar picture of trying to patent your research or creating intellectual property rights around it. I'm not saying that any of this is unimportant or should be, or that we should stop doing it, but it's only one fraction of the picture. And we need to do more in order to own our license and our mandate in society. And that's really something that has been emerging as a consensus, even I would say, on the political agenda in the European member states and also with the OECD. You find a lot of reports out there, and I could have mentioned even more from the academies of Europe, from the European Commission itself, from different types of associations of universities and the OECD, all encouraging researchers to communicate our knowledge more actively into society and connecting with citizens and policymakers, also industrialists when it's relevant, but definitely putting more emphasis on getting research across. And there is a reason for that. And one of them is that outside scientific institutions, trust in authorities is at the same time challenged. I wouldn't go so far to say that it's declining, that we can perhaps use as an open question for debate. But a lot of things are happening out there, and I'm aware of the fact that most of you are already quite worried about misinformation and disinformation and polarization, and how social media are stimulating specific types of biases and tribal psychology. But this really notion of being able to separate facts from, let's say, fake news or from alternative truth is becoming an increasingly societal challenge. And I don't think this is a challenge we can solve by just creating more technology. It's not an engineering problem. It's really a cognitive and cultural and communicative problem to understand how to select information in a way that is trustworthy and to some extent evidence informed. And this also ties into a broader crisis in society in which the idea that we can just take for granted that people are listening, or we just wanted to take for granted that scientific institutions are providing benefits to people, I believe we are simply no longer in a position to do that. So there is a lot of vitality, there is a lot of movements out there, there is a whole new, you can say, epistemic culture emerging. Some of that has to do with the internet and artificial intelligence and the emergence of a whole new information ecosystem, but some of it also has to do with values and socio-economic developments, and the fact that not all citizens got to get a part of globalization. They were not all as equally protected by science as we in the academy likes to think. So that's why they're revolting, and they're revolting against policymakers for lack of benefits and lack of foresight, but they're also revolting against scientists, experts, pharmaceuticals, and it can become a problem if we don't really think carefully about how to reconnect with those similar publics, even creating private realities. Let's save that for another time. Interestingly enough, you also see a number of public controversies over trusted knowledge. So what kind of knowledge can you actually trust in society? Obviously, even though I would be happy to say that we are getting to a point in which most citizens are accepting the fact of anthropogenic climate change, it actually took more than 30 years to establish this as a public fact. Even despite up against 90% consensus in the academic peer-reviewed literature, it's still taking us more than 2 decades to get this to become a key societal priority. You have discussions around GMO, you have discussions around nuclear, antibiotics, vaccine uptakes, harm reduction, transitions from cigarettes to e-cigarettes. So you find the public today, like a public environment, a public life, a public discourse that is very much characterized by controversies around science. So science is not perceived as either neutral, objective, and for sure not authoritative. It's seen as one input among others, and an input that we cannot just take for granted is being trusted or trustworthy in the first place. At the same time, we also have some reason for optimism. Whereas in this Eurobarometer analysis that is already a couple of years old, almost 4 out of 10 respondents reported that they came across fake news every day or almost every day. But at the same time, and this is noticeable, almost 7 out of 10 European citizens agreed that scientists should intervene more in political debate to ensure that decisions take into account evidence. So there is actually a hunger and appetite. There is a need out there for science to take a more prominent role. So this is not all bad. How can we then do that? The need for trusted science communication has never been greater. I think that's a good avenue to start thinking about what to do for science communication in Europe and within our individual member states. How can we actually create trusted science communication for the benefit of people? And even though none of us really like to talk more about it, this little irritating virus that shut down society for more than 2 years, I think it's also a testimony to the fact that there would have been no successful response capacity had it not been for science communication. And obviously I'm a little bit biased here as a professor of science communication myself, and having worked somewhat with the Danish government and Danish media landscape, but we could see how much at least behavioral science, to some extent communication, to some extent even psychology, became crucial for the response capacity. So no matter how much we would have known about the epidemiological models and modeling the virus in society and how it was disseminating throughout different social groups, it needed communication in order to become effective solutions. And I hope we can take some of that and use it also for the green transition, for climate change adaptation. There needs to be a lot of things done for citizens to understand how serious this threat is. It might not be as visible and not as intrusive as a small virus that gets into your body, but this is definitely something that will dominate the agenda of the entire next generation and more. So we need again here to make sure we have the right priorities and the right instruments available to stimulate very proactive science communication. How do we do that? First of all, we have to acknowledge, and here I will be a little bit technical for the next 2 to 3 minutes, but bear with me. I think it's important to get some of these observations on the table. We know that people form beliefs about the world based on both factual input and normative values. It is not so that people are just forming their beliefs based on what science says or what has been mentioned in the news. They are constantly, and for good reasons, selecting what facts to trust based on values. And we need to understand that as science communicators. In political discourse, for the same reasons, evidence cannot stand alone. This is something we have been educating our scientists and our science communicators. Get the evidence on the table. Perhaps not the PDF files, but then at least get the evidence on the table. Tell people what they don't know. Tell people what they haven't yet understood. But this is not really what we see in most current studies. We see that in order for people to accept evidence, you need to connect your data, your analysis, your findings exactly with the world of values and preferably also deliberation. So you need to give your audience a chance to become active in their own learning, to actually engage with science and to be able to ask questions and in that sense digest the messages given a respect for their own worldview. So the worldview of citizens and their values, even if they might not agree with you, are actually not your enemy here. It's actually our friend and it's our ally in the sense if we want to get research across. And also the same goes for policymakers. Just like everybody else, they pick the evidence that help them solve some pressing problems. So if you don't have any evidence or you don't have any knowledge that can actually make people help solve their problems, then they might not listen to you. So we have to think very carefully what these findings actually mean when you want to connect with policymakers. Have you really understood their problems, their reality? Have you understood their goals? What are they confronted with? You need to understand some of those things in order to fit your research onto their agenda. And there can be no other way than doing it that way. Actually, a new paper just published a couple of weeks ago showed that values is a better predictor for trust in both evidence and policy making than your socioeconomic background. So you might think, of course, that there is a connection between socioeconomic background and your values, and to some extent, obviously, there are. But values might also be very different in different socioeconomic groups. And therefore, when you start working with mindset and values and purpose and integrate it into your science communication plan, you have a much better chance of actually reaching your audience and making an impact upon them. And what we also know in terms of building trust is that there is a necessity for transparency. You have to be quite open, but also emphasizing this responsiveness to the needs and problems of citizens. So we have to understand, how do their world look like? How can you actually infuse some research as one among several perspectives in order for people to become more empowered in their own life to solve some of those problems that seem relevant and pertinent in their environment? You cannot solve problems for them, and you shouldn't be more smart than they are in terms of understanding their own life and livelihood. So you need to include their perspective. Here is the paper that I was referencing. It just came out, actually only a week ago. It's making its round out there on social media. But one of the statements from Pedersen and colleagues I just picked out here. Researchers and science communicators, perhaps policymakers, need to exhaust alternative explanations based on people's goals and social environments, what I just mentioned, before assuming that they are irrational, and to use methods that engage participants as active partners in their own lives and not just targets of intervention. And we could stop the talk here, and I will stop in a couple of minutes, but actually I think this is a quite good recipe for what we need to do, and it is a little bit turning things on its head. It's not about convincing people, it's definitely not about persuasion, it's about engaging and empowering people to actually solve their own problems based on the research we have available and we can communicate and disseminate. Another interesting book here was published a couple of years ago, also in partly drawing on social psychology and cognitive science, by Arthur Lupia. He was then actually the funding director at the National Science Foundation in Washington for the behavioral sciences, and it prompted him to publish a book. And he just gives us a couple of really good advices that I think is beneficial when we speak about science advice. One is that we have to understand that for all of us, not only some random citizens or internet users, but for all of us, including the professors themselves, we all have cognitive limitations. We have a very limited capacity to process new information, and the information we do process, we make it fit to our established categories. For all of us, there is an information overload. There simply is excessive and complex information that might lead every citizen to disengage from the evidence in questions. You simply just get overwhelmed if you're presented with large amount of data sheets and publications and analysis. There are also motivational factors. There can be a lack of interest and perceived irrelevance that might discourage learning about science and politics if it seems not to connect to my everyday life, if it doesn't have any bearing on the problems I'm experiencing, then you simply zoom out, you disconnect. It doesn't seem important, it doesn't mean you're irrational, it doesn't mean you're a victim of misinformation, but you simply just allocate your attention for something else. And what can we do about it? Again, from Arthur here, a couple of good recommendations. We do have to simplify information. More data is not always good data. Sometimes you need to put data into a narrative, make it more easily accessible, present scientific and also, in this case, political information in a way that can be accessed. You have to tailor your messages. So that means you have to customize information to fit the audience interest and needs, and understand, as I just mentioned a moment ago, understand where is your audience, where are the target of your information or communication campaign, and then tailor the messages. People do not like to be targeted with very generic communication. And then again, it's also mentioned in the studies leading up to this book. You have to encourage active learning, so that is active participation, for example, through encouragement of discussions and debates and other hands-on activities. So you can, in a way, say that this is not really rocket science. It's simply about understanding people and including them as worthy participants and co-creators of their own life and lifestyle. So enough about cognitive psychology. I thought it was important just to make that hook into the current literature because it is challenging some of our categories. So the good news is that a lot of things are happening out there. There is a lot of different institutions in today's societies, including Luxembourg and Copenhagen and Brussels, in which people are getting more and more eager to communicate research to policymakers and to citizens. It is not all well coordinated, and this is one of, I think, the challenges we have in front of us, how to build capacity, how to teach science communicators to become better communicators and to understand citizens' needs, but also how to work with all these different advisory institutions in a little bit more coordinated way, so that we don't see as much fragmentation as we see. This list was compiled by the European Commission. They also asked me to compile a whole ecosystem of different advisory units. And again, what we saw in the work conducted for the Commission was that there is a lot of things happening out there. I wouldn't say that there necessarily is competition for advice and communication, but there is definitely overlap and to some extent fragmentation. It seems that a lot of the advisory units that we have within our societies do not really know what the other units are doing, and it is rarely that there is national oversight. So we conducted country studies in Denmark and in Finland and in Spain and Portugal and other countries, and what we saw was pretty much the same picture, that there is a lot of availability and a lot of supply of evidence, but that it is poorly organized, poorly orchestrated. So that's one of the things that we might take a closer look on, building back better, both in this sort of post-pandemic time, but also looking to climate change, to regulation of artificial intelligence, to the biodiversity crisis, to the geopolitical security crisis. We need to have concerted effort. So there needs to be more communication even within these ecosystems. We tried then to make a new evaluation matrix and evaluation framework. What is good science advice? What is, in a certain sense, good science communication? This is very hard to come up with a standardized metric to say this is well-placed communication and this is poorly placed communication. But one thing we could see in the study we conducted for the Commission was that at least it does make sense to be well connected, to be able to include the perspective of users very early, and also to talk to other science communicators, preferably across disciplines and also across policy silos. So rather than staying in your own lane, what really works and that can cross-pollinate good science advice is for people to connect to each other and learn from each other, particularly within your national ecosystem, also in some cases across national borders, as the Commission is trying to push for. And then finally, this is where I'm going to stop, but I think there can be no discussion about science communication in a changing world without ethics. And ethical principles are just super important for us to discuss in order to, again, design the right ecosystem. What is it that a vibrant ecosystem of scientific communication and advice is characterized by? What is it that makes it work? So some of the things we found across all these different international organizations, the Commission, the UK government, the OECD, the National Academies of Science in the States, was almost univocal support that scientific advice mechanisms needs to be independent, that you need to cultivate transparency, that there needs to be a clear division of labor leading to clearly defined roles and responsibilities, that you need to stand accountable. Scientists need to be accountable for scientific information. Policymakers need to be accountable for political decisions. There needs to be diversity in the way we are communicating science to the public and to policymakers. It can no longer be so that you're just communicating research from one discipline and only inviting social sciences or behavioral sciences on board once in a while. Diversity, both in cognitive style, but also in demographics, actually means something to the people's trust in science communication, that they can see their own values and their own profile also reflected in the way we are communicating science, so that it is not only, again, old white males communicating science from the laboratory or from the desk, but it is also giving a more diverse picture of people. And you have to be rigorous, and you have to understand finally that there is a difference here between the world of science and the world of politics. So even though some scientists, they do tend to get very close to the political process, and they might even be associated with political parties and called up all the time for the same newspapers to give the same type of expertise, demarcation means in the philosophy of science that you need to make clear what is your scientific advice, your judgment, your analysis, And then what is the role of the policymaker, of the values of citizens, so that you don't try to preempt discussions or have an already, you can say, closed mind before you start engaging. So these are some of the principles we develop for the commissions. And then just remember that facts do not speak for themselves. It really do need translation and engagement. Thank you.